So good morning, everyone. Today we are going to talk about alternatives to experimentation, yung mga non-experimental designs. So our chapter objectives are to learn about techniques about studying behavior that do not manipulate antecedent conditions, understand the concept of phenomenology and how it is employed, learn to conduct new research using data already collected by other researchers, learn about techniques employed in observational research, and familiarize yourselves with the basics of qualitative research. So sa traditional psychology experiment, we create specific sets of antecedent conditions or treatments so that we can test our hypothesis about behavior. And to use experimental approach, yung researcher must be able to set up these conditions para sa mga magiging participants or subject of the experiment. So many times yung requirement na to cannot be met. So for example, if you want to study yung mga existing characteristics of participants such as gender, intelligence, or occupation para makita kung ano yung influence nito sa behavior. So because we cannot create yung antecedent conditions in these situations, we need to gather data in other ways. So sometimes, yung conditions we want to study, such as yung smoking, pregnancy, or being homeless, cannot be created because of ethical reasons. So sometimes, researchers want to study behavior as it occurs naturally. So walang treatment na gagamitin na conditions. So the non-experimental approaches are used in situations wherein yung experiment is not practical or desirable. They are also used kung whenever testing a hypothesis in an existing real-life situation is necessary or important. So yung mga non-experimental methods, they are used to study behavior in natural settings. For example, naglalaro ng mga bata, parenting, life in a gang, so that we can explore unique or rare occurrences. So because each of these non-experimental approaches can provide useful data, either from single individuals or from large groups of people, this is important for us to understand and how we can apply this in psychological research. So there are 5 common non-experimental approach. We have phenomenology, case study, field studies, archival studies, and qualitative studies. I have also included here yung surveys and interviews later on so that we will know the common non-experimental approach. So the first one is phenomenology. This is the description of an individual's immediate experience. So rather than looking at behaviors and events na external to us, we begin with personal experience as the source of data. So with this type of research or design, yung mga antecedent conditions are not manipulated. And yung data may consist of any immediate experience ng isang tao. So if you remember si William James, isa siya sa mga famous early psychologists. He also used phenomenological approach. So in his work sa Principles ng Psychology, he dealt with basic psychological issues including yung habits, emotions, consciousness, and the stream of thoughts. So he approached most of his ideas through phenomenological perspective of his own experiences. So he pointed out na yung resistance to getting up inhibits our movement. So marami siyang nabigay na importanteng data or information regarding behavior because of this approach. And we have to remember na since yung phenomenology is it deals with immediate experience, yung conclusions niya is instantaneous, meaning they emerge at once and hindi na natin kailangan mag-wait ng results ng calculations na nakuha natin sa measurements or sa data analysis. Hindi rin gumagamit yung phenomenologies ng mga statistics since frequency does not occur at an instant and cannot be easily determined. Phenomenology cannot be used to understand causes of behavior. Kasi like other non-experimental designs, yung phenomenology, nagde-describe lang siya, okay? Hindi siya nag-i-explain ng behavior. And then phenomenology may lead us into areas of discovery that might otherwise go unnoticed. So this can be useful na source of information that may lead us to formulate hypotheses. These days, yung phenomenology, seldom na lang siya, if ever used, as research method on its own kasi yung iba, experimentation na talaga yung ginagamit.
Welcome to the McCAD Multimedia Series, a McCAD analysis of William James's The Principles of Psychology. Since, for psychology, a mind is an object in a world of other objects, its relation to those other objects must be surveyed. The 19th century American psychologist William James wrote those words in his The Principles of Psychology. And they take us to the heart of his aims in composing a book he hoped would establish psychology as a natural science. James highlighted the uncertainty of psychology, writing that everyone's perceptions and thoughts are contextualized by experience, previous thought patterns, memories, and so on. Therefore, he argued, the thought depends on the person thinking it. James theorized that consciousness and physiology went hand in hand. He believed that it was important to study both in order to develop knowledge of psychology as a field in its own right. This theory was later named the James Lange theory of emotion. But exactly how did James think that mind and body worked together? Let's create a hypothetical scenario and apply his theory. Meet Sabrina. She's hiking through the forest when she encounters a bear. James believed that typically perception would trigger a chain reaction, starting with lower physiological reactions. These would then feed information up the hierarchy towards Sabrina's consciousness. In this case, then, perception is becoming aware of the bear, seeing it. At this point, Sabrina's physiological responses are triggered: increased heart rate, trembling, and sweating. This leads to other physiological responses that James considered were higher up the hierarchy of reactions. Almost certainly, Sabrina will begin to pay an increasing amount of attention to the bear. Only after these basic responses did James say the mind would kick in. Then, the construct of panic and fear would be felt. In other words, James theorized that Sabrina will react physically first, and only then, after this physical reaction is interpreted by her mind, will her consciousness determine what emotions and thoughts she's experiencing. His assertion that context is integral to understanding any given psychological event can also be demonstrated by the presence of our hypothetical bear. Let's imagine that instead of roaming free, our bear is in a cage. It makes sense that Sabrina's physiological response to a somewhat safer encounter would be different and less likely to result in feelings of fear. If Sabrina has frequent contact with bears, if she works as a bear handler, say, then her response would be different again. As James's theory suggests, past experience is an important component of an individual's consciousness. William James is often cited as one of the founders of functional psychology. A more detailed examination of his ideas can be found in the McCAT analysis.
Okay, so remember, for phenomenology, it only describes, but it does not explain yung behavior. And then we come to case studies. So like phenomenology, yung case study involves no manipulation ng antecedent conditions. So the case study is a descriptive record of a single individual's experiences, behaviors, or both. kept by an outside observer. So yung mga record na to may be produced systematically recording yung mga experiences and behaviors as they have occurred over time. So yung clinical psychology in particular, they rely heavily sa case studies. So it's employed extensively sa forensic psychology and organizational psychology as well. So frequently, as in sa clinical case, we may work from a record made after the fact, and then the patient or other knowledgeable sources, they provide information concerning the events in the patient's life and patient's reactions and behaviors. So generally, may restrictions naman on the type of data na makukolect natin sa case study. So many case studies would be expected to fall in the low portion. So even though yung mga case studies natin will be able to gather data without constraint, some case study will severely restrict yung kind of information collected. So Kasdan has argued na yung case studies has 5 major purposes. So the first one, it's a source of inference, hypothesis, and theories. Okay. So first, we may use case study to make inferences about yung impact of life events, yung origin ng disorders or developmental processes. So for example, this approach provided by the first systematic data on development ng children's motor, cognitive, and linguistic abilities. So by making yung mga extensive records of behaviors ng individual, yung mga children, early researcher arrived at descriptions ng normal developmental sequences. So modern researchers have used yung mga neuropsychological case studies ng mga brain damaged individuals to identify yung areas of the brain na related to specific abilities. For example, yung right basal ganglia appears to be involved sa mental rotation of objects. So, meron din case study si Freud, yung case ni Little Hans. So this is an example of how an individual's case may suggest a developmental process. So si Hans, natatakot daw siya sa mga horses. So Freud's analysis of Hans' conversations with his father and yung dreams he reported suggested na yung fear of horses niya was a symbol for Hans' fear of his father and anxiety about castration. So such case studies led to yung formulation ni Freud ng kanyang theory of the Oedipus complex. And then second, as we understand the impact of such events more fully, we may be able to devise more appropriate treatment techniques as well as preventive measures. If you remember yung talking cure sa psychotherapy, for instance, ito yung result of treatment of the historical symptoms in Ana O. So ito yung one of the early cases of Freud. And then third, the case study is a perfect forum for investigating unique cases or rare problems. So, for example, variants ng paraphilia. For example, cross-dressing, sexual masochism, yung BDSM, or yung pedophilia. Okay. Some in clinical settings, case studies can be useful na sources of information. So one interesting na approach or case involved sa influences ng testosterone therapy on female to male transgendered na individual. It's a relatively rare na occurrence. So yung ginawa nila is that they compared yung mga yung diary ng subject over the past 2 years to see if there is some changes or there are notes about yung pag-take niya ng testosterone. And yun nga, based sa kanyang sinulat lang, the researchers found that there were measurable changes sa style ng individual's written language during the 20-day cycles. Yung diary entries were much more likely to mention yung mga social interactions kasi and the individual's connection sa iba. Fourth, case studies can provide evidence that casts doubt on theories or generally accepted practices. For example, sa psychoanalytic notion na it could be harmful to treat overt symptoms of dysfunction without treating their base causes as negated as counter instances accumulated. Meaning, mas maganda daw, tignan muna natin yung past behavior niya or mga experiences ng childhood niya before we can actually treat the person so that we know the source. And fifth, case studies are sometimes a dramatic way to illustrate yung mga abstract concepts. Yeah, yun nga, seeing is to believe. So hence, yung mga advertisers, they frequently use case studies to sell products kasi because they are so compelling, case studies can excite interest or bring about new research. Pero nga, the problem with case studies is that matagal siya. It would take a few years for you to finish kasi you will not gather so much data within months lang.
Mr. Y is a 78-year-old man who was born in Korea and moved to Canada with his wife 50 years ago. Together, the couple opened a floral shop and ran the business for 40 years. When Mr. Y was in his late 60s, he started having difficulty making his favorite flower arrangements. He began misplacing tools, losing paper orders, and forgetting important pickup times. At home, he had problems remembering recent events and began waking up at odd hours in the night, thinking it was time to open the shop. When Mr. Y was 70 years old, the family decided to sell the business. Their healthcare providers confirmed that Mr. Y was presenting with early-stage Alzheimer's disease. He also had osteoarthritis and a history of urinary tract infections. Mrs. Y cared for her husband at home during those years. When Mr. Y turned 75, his memory worsened, and he most often forgot where things were in the house. He often woke his wife at odd hours of the night, thinking it was time to get up and get ready. Mr. Y grew physically weak and suffered from frequent falls at home. A few times, Mr. Y had become lost outside of their home, forgetting where he had to go and which house was his. Their son recognized that his mother was constantly worrying about her husband's increasing care needs and could not enjoy activities she used to do. She was stressed and was not sleeping properly. With support from their healthcare providers, the family decided that a long-term care setting would benefit Mr. Y and Mrs. Y's well-being. During the first week in long-term care, the staff noticed Mr. Y pacing the hallways, pushing on locked doors, and entering other residents' rooms. When approached by the nursing staff, he had repetitive questions. Who are you? What do I do? Where do I go? Mr. Y required frequent reminders that this was his new home. During meals, Mr. Y ate little, despite encouragement and staff offering assistance. During personal care, such as changing, toileting, and showering, Mr. Y scratched, grabbed, and screamed at the personal support workers, PSWs. 2 staff were required during these care activities. At the end of the second week in long-term care, Mr. Y was no longer pacing the halls. He was often found napping in his room during the days. One afternoon, a PSW went into Mr. Y's room to bring him to have lunch and found him sleeping. She tried to gently wake Mr. Y, but he was not easy to arouse. In the dining room, Mr. Y stared out the window. When the PSW asked him for his lunch preference, Mr. Y rambled slowly in English and in Korean. Yes, my wife is cooking. I will eat. When the meal came, he barely touched it. When there were group activities, the therapist found it harder and harder to get Mr. Y to attend and participate. He sometimes fell asleep in the middle of the exercise or social program. A few nights in a row, he was found wandering outside his bedroom without his walker. One time, he told the PSW, "Someone is looking for me." The PSW reassured him that he is safe and tried to direct him back to his room. but Mr. Y walked past the PSW and said, "I have to go to the bus stop." This behavior continued with increasing disorientation. The sleep disturbances resulted in Mr. Y being too drowsy in the mornings and not able to eat any breakfast. Although Mrs. Y was kept informed of her husband's condition since admission, it was not until her first visit during Mr. Y's third week in long-term care when she realized how much her husband had changed. She was alarmed and asked the staff, "What is happening? What will be done for him? How can I help?"
Okay. So this was a case study regarding Mr. Y and the case of Alzheimer's. Next, we have field studies. So they are non-experimental approaches na used in the field or in real-life settings. So researchers doing field studies often combine various types of data gathering in order to capitalize on the richness and range of behavior found outside the laboratory. Of course, yung antecedent conditions hindi siya manipulated, but the degree of constraint on responses varies considerably from study to study. So first, the first type of field studies is naturalistic observation. I'm sure that you have heard of this. So this is the technique of observing behaviors as they occur spontaneously in natural settings. It's a descriptive method also, like phenomenology and case study method. This involves no manipulation of antecedent conditions. And yung mga responses ng subjects are free to vary. So because yung researcher imposes very few constraints, yung naturalistic observation um, is also considered as a low non-experimental design, kumbaga. So the naturalistic observation approach has been used extensively sa animal behavior research like ethology to study behavior sa wild as well as yung mga nasa captivity. So perhaps the most well-known naturalistic observation were those recorded by Dian Fossey. Siya yung nag-study ng family life and social bonds of rare mountain gorillas living in the Virunga volcano sa Central Africa. When they conduct naturalistic observations, researchers attempt to remain inconspicuous. So they remain out of sight or they blend in with the environment so that yung behaviors they observe are not altered by the presence of the observer. So yun nga, minsan, if people know that they are being observed, they change their behavior accordingly, katulad ng Hawthorne studies. So whether the subjects of the observations are animal or human, every attempt is made to keep the setting as natural as possible so that the naturally occurring events will not be altered in any way. Okay, itong element na to creates a special challenge kasi in a typical laboratory, yung researcher has only a small set of behaviors to record. Pero kasi when you conduct naturalistic observations, you must contend with a vast array ng responses, often including yung mga unanticipated or mga unconventional na responses. So using a naturalistic observation is often essential and even preferable to experimentation. Of course, it varies naman kung ano yung psychological phenomena yung gusto mong study. Times necessary naman to compare laboratory findings with behaviors in natural settings to confirm yung usefulness ng laboratory setting for a particular na research topic. Because some behaviors might be distorted by bringing them sa laboratory setting, such behaviors are best observed kung nag-o-occur sila naturally. So naturalistic observation provides a wealth of descriptive na information, but this research method does not lend itself to testing casual antecedent behaviors or determining yung cause and effect. Another type of field studies is the participant observer studies. So here, yung researcher actually becomes part ng group being studied. So sometimes ito lang yung only method that can be used to study a group, particularly if the group hindi sila um, hindi mo sila ini-expect na mag-cooperate kung sasabihan mo na gusto mo mag-observe. In some cases, yung group members are not told na they are part of a study. Kasi once their presence is known, yung researchers run the risk that yung subject's behavior might change because yung observer is present. Participant observer studies usually do not include yung mga systematic na observation or measurement techniques. Instead, yung mga data gathered tend to be qualitative or yung mga impressions lang na researcher as merely described. So participant observers are typically trying to gather as much information in detail as they can. And it might have occurred to you na yung field studies can trigger yung mga special ethical concerns. And it might become somehow problematic. Kasi a great deal of thought needs to go sa observational research before it is conducted. So is your observation going to make an important contribution sa psychological knowledge? Baka you're invading the privacy of others. And is it ethical na hindi mo sabihin sa mga tao na pinag-aaralan mo sila? Is it ethical to pretend to be a group member? So you have to keep in mind yung ethical guidelines natin. So, baka if you were to be a subject in your own study, how do you feel about it na parang may nag-i-invade or parang may nag-o-observe sa inyo and hindi niya sinabi? So when it comes to observational research, yung opinions from the IRB can be especially valuable for weighing these issues objectively.
In the following short animation, we will be talking about the naturalistic observation method, an important method in psychology. This method may seem familiar to you because a less formal version of this method is the stuff of nature documentaries and films. Most of the time that you are watching a nature film, you are watching a variation of the naturalistic observation method. You see, naturalistic observation is the secret observation of animals, and, as we will talk later, humans, in their natural environments. So every time you are watching a nature show in which the narrator is watching wildlife secretly in nature, like at a watering hole, in the jungle, ocean, or savanna, this is an example of naturalistic observation. Now, psychologists can use a similar method to watch humans surreptitiously in their natural environments. For example, to see how people act in crowds, as at a baseball game, or in church, or during a street demonstration. Remember that, like all research methods, naturalistic observations have both strengths and weaknesses or limitations. For example, its greatest strength is that it allows researchers to look at what they are most interested in, real behavior in the real world. However, at the same time, at least with regards to humans, there are of course important limitations with respect to this method. First of all, in particular, we must respect people's privacy. Psychologists can't go creeping through people's backyards engaging in naturalistic observation, but, importantly, must conduct their observations only in public. A second limitation is that naturalistic observations are good at telling us what people are doing, but not why they are doing these things. For example, around the world, people speak to babies in very similar ways. But naturalistic observation is not very good at telling us why people speak to babies this way.
Yun. Okay. So sa naturalistic observation, yung um, what you're writing is your observation, merely your observation, but it does not ask why. So you may do this, you may ask why sa surveys, sa interviews, or sa other methods of gathering data. Okay, so next. Next is the archival study. So this is a descriptive research method in which already existing records are re-examined for a new purpose. So many opportunities for field research can be found in data that have been collected for other purposes and stored sa data archives. So vast amounts of data are collected by government, by private agencies, by hospitals, by businesses, schools, institutes, and so on. So information about such things as crime rates, death rates, education levels, salaries, yung housing patterns, disease rates, these are accessible to researchers by archivals or mga archives. So there are also archives housing data from scientific research surveys and some using very large national samples. In an interesting use sa archival data, someone studied some controversial issues about African American men, namely um, documented na discouragement over barriers to employment and problems sa family roles. So his study looked at factors related sa facilitative adaptive coping mechanism ng 372 na African American men who were responsible husbands and fathers. So yung data na nag-gather before, collected in 1979 to 1980 were face-to-face interviews. And then he found that kinship bonds and religious beliefs were stronger in men who were happy in their family roles. And he suggested na yung family closeness and religion might help to mediate family role difficulties. Because hindi naman to experiment, causal inferences cannot be supported. However, yung mga valuable information for further study on these important issues was gained. So yung problem lang with archival study is that mahihirapan ka mag-gather ng data kasi minsan yung iba is only handwritten and parang masisira na yung mga copies nila. Ngayon, we are able to access information through the internet, pero what about sa data na hindi na-record dyan sa internet? So, minsan you have to go to the library pa to research, or you go to institutions where they keep yung mga old datas. And then we have qualitative research. So qualitative research relies on words rather than numbers for data being collected. So it focuses on self-report, personal narratives, expression of ideas, memories, feelings, and thoughts. So even though it's fair to say na yung most psychologists conducting research today strongly favor yung quantitative approach, kasi yun nga, with quanti, we are able to validate our data through numbers. Masasabi natin na correlated sila because of these numbers. Masasabi natin na it's a predictor of something because meron tayong number na mapapakita. Pero ngayon, without understanding yung mga qualitative methods, one cannot really appreciate yung breadth ng research methodology used by contemporary psychological scientists. Qualitative research is used to study phenomena that are contextual, meaning they cannot be understood without yung context in which they appear. So these phenomena deserve to be studied within a rich background or unique environment. So for example, religious faith and belief in a divine being. So religiousness has been studied quantitatively for many years. So there are very good standard tests that can be used to measure yung strength ng religious faith mo as a useful measurement in quantitative research. Typically, this kind of research looks at yung relationship between religiousness and other personality or other variable. For example, a study that investigated yung impact ng religiousness sa outcomes of cardiac surgery. So among other results, they found that on average, more religious individuals tended to have shorter hospital stays after surgery. It's somehow, sabi nila, a very interesting finding. That's quanti. But for a qualitative researcher, hindi sila magko-contend sa statistical averages or statistical relationship between scores on scales. A qualitative researcher might want to know about the fuller experience ng individual's religiousness and faith in the context of impending surgery to fully describe yung experience and understand yung meaning na bakit nila ginagawa to. So instead of using statistics to evaluate yung relationship between religiousness and recovery after surgery, yung qualitative researcher would use words to extract yung meaningful common themes and would support them with actual narratives from the study participants. And then next, we have surveys. So very familiar tayo when it comes to surveys because we are exposed to them all the time. Meron tayong sa Facebook, mga polls, ratings, television ratings, customer satisfaction. So it's a useful way of obtaining information about people's opinions, attitudes, preferences, and behaviors simply by asking. So survey allows us to gather data about experiences, feelings, and thoughts, and motives na mahirap ma-observe directly. So surveys can be particularly useful for collecting data na about sensitive topics because they can be given anonymously. So, if you remember, kung may na-take ka na survey, hindi sila directly nag-ask for your name. It may be mag-ask sila ng code name or optional lang talaga yung name, pwedeng wala kang ilagay. So survey allows us to gather large amount of data efficiently. So this is one of the advantage of survey. Kasi pwede mo siyang ilagay mo sa internet, sa Facebook, and then you can have your Facebook friends answer this one. So in one day, baka makagather ka agad ng mga 100 na answers or participants. So although yung surveys are low in manipulation ng antecedents, they can range from low to high in the imposition of units. So written questionnaires and face-to-face interviews ang yung common na survey techniques in psychology research. So questionnaires can be handed out or sent to the email, sometimes sa computer in the laboratory or via internet. Pwede mo siyang matawagan sa phone or pwedeng mag face-to-face interviews kayo. So the generalizability of survey and interview results is determined largely by the procedures we use to select our subjects. So yung mga sampling procedures or sampling methods. So later on, we will talk about probability and non-probability sampling. Okay, so constructing surveys. Paano ka nga ba magko-construct ng survey? Some people say that they are good at it already. Kasi, I don't know, madali lang naman magsulat ng questions. But actually, constructing a good survey is much more than a matter of sitting down for an hour and writing out yung mga questions. So unless you understand yung important components ng survey construction, you are likely to construct a survey that will not provide any meaningful information at all. Okay, so experts say sa survey construction na yung first step is to map out research objectives, making them as specific as possible. Okay, so you may want to know ano nga ba yung gusto kong makuha. So to simply say you want to measure your attitudes toward animal research in psychology is too much general para sa research objectives. We want to be as specific as possible so that we can know what questions we want to include. And then once you have established your objectives, the next step is to design yung survey items. So the first step is to decide how you are going to address the imposition of units. Do you want to give your subjects long free responses to your questions, or gusto mo yung restricted lang na yes or no? Many surveys include an assortment of both types of questions. Pwede silang on a scale of 1 to 10 or yes or no lang or by essay type. Okay, sa surveys mo, it can be a closed question, meaning yes or no lang, or 1 to 10, you rate them 1 to 10. So limited lang yung magiging response nila to that option. Pero when you say open-ended na question, you solicit information about opinions by asking a question in such a way na they have to respond with more than just saying yes or no. So beforehand, you have to decide if you will include open-ended questions or closed-ended questions or both. Okay, and how do you measure your responses? So creating an open-ended questions is usually just a matter of writing simply worded question na nagre-require ng subjects to answer in narrative form rather than selecting a choice. So when we are creating closed questions for our survey, we can use number for different formats. If you have encountered or answered a questionnaire before, kung meron siyang specific numbers na nakalagay. For example, if you say yes, there's a corresponding number. And then if you say no, there's also a corresponding number. So sa closed-ended questions, we can have those numbers. Pero sa open-ended questions, or katulad sa mga essay, sa quizzes or exams, the score would depend sa researcher alone. And if you remember yung level of measurements sa stats nyo, these are used to measure a response. The simplest level of measurement, yung nominal scale, this classifies response item into two or more distinct categories on the basis of some common feature. Okay, so parang red, green, blue is color, and ano pa? 1, 2, 3 are numbers, ganun. And then the next level of measurement is called an ordinal scale. So ito yung rank ordering of response items. So the magnitude of each value is measured in the form of ranks. Tulad ng pre-election polls, kung sino yung bet nila na presidential candidates. So these are written in an used by ordinal scale. The next is an interval scale. So this measures magnitude or quantitative size using measures with equal intervals between values. So yung interval scale, wala siyang true 0 point. Example dito is temperature. So it may be on temperature below 0 are possible on both scales. And then common number scales like 1 to 4 or 0 to 100 that you have seen in surveys are considered interval scales. Okay, so yung highest level of measurement is called the ratio scale. So this has equal intervals between all values and the true 0 point. So measurements of physical properties such as height, weight, are characteristics whose quantity or magnitude can be measured using ratio scales. Okay, sa lahat ng level of measurement, yung may true 0 point lang is the ratio scale. What if you want to use a survey questionnaire na already established na criteria that you have to look for para sa research mo is dapat makikita mo yung validity niya and reliability. So yun yung una mong titignan. And then, kailan pa ba ginawa yung questionnaire na to? Okay, we have to look for evidence suggesting that this is a good instrument to use. And then, collecting survey data can take many forms. Pwede siyang written questionnaires, mail surveys, telephone, internet surveys, interviews, and focus group. Okay, so self-administered questionnaire, ibibigay mo sa kanila and then sila yung mag-answer. If you are handing out your questionnaire in person, consider yung possibility of reactivity. And then, of course, remember, you have to collect your questionnaire data anonymously. Hindi naman kailangan to ask subjects to identify themselves sa kanilang questionnaire. And then, mail surveys, computer and internet surveys, telephone surveys, pero minsan na lang yun. And then, of course, interview. Ito yung one of the best ways to gather high quality na survey data is to conduct yung face-to-face na interview. So dapat yung interviewer, they must be thoroughly trained in interviewing skills and techniques. Sa face-to-face interviews, researchers have found that female interviewers tend to be more successful sa male interviewers. So how do you interview a person? Do you just go up to them and say, hi, can I interview you? Ganon. There's proper etiquette for that. Katulad ng nilagay ko sa assignment nyo for interview, kailangan nyo ma-observe yung proper etiquette. So first off, technique called establishing rapport. Okay, so parang rude naman kung ask nyo agad yung person to answer your surveys. Okay, so you have to establish rapport, you introduce yourself, ano ba yung purpose mo, and then you ask something about themselves, and is it okay for them, for you to interview them. And then of course, if you are planning to record yung session or yung interview, you have to ask permission about that also. Okay, and then you will decide kung structured yung interview mo or unstructured. So sa structured, yung same questions are asked precisely each way at the same. Paulit-ulit lang siya. So unstructured, more free-flowing, ikaw yung bahala kung ano yung susunod mong itatanong. And then focus groups, etc. And then we come to sampling. Okay. So regardless of how you conduct your survey, one of the critical issues is sampling. How you decide kung sino yung subjects and then how you select them. So selecting subjects is an important part of any research regardless kung anong design yung ginagamit mo. So yung population consists of all people, animals, or objects that have at least one characteristic in common, and a sample of subjects is yung group that is a subset of the population of interest. So data collected from samples can be used to draw inferences about a population without examining all of its members. So in this way, you are able to make predictions about an outcome kahit na hindi mo sinample lahat ng tao. So how accurately can we generalize our findings from a given sample to a population depends on its representativeness or yung how closely the sample mirrors yung larger population. To do this, we would have to use yung sampling. We have two general kinds, probability and non-probability sampling. So probability sampling involves selecting subjects in such a way na yung odds of their being in the study are known or can be calculated. We begin by defining yung population we want to study. And then yung second condition is that the researcher must use an unbiased method for selecting subjects. You can use yung wheel or para randomize, or yung fishbowl method wherein you write yung numbers and then you pick a number and kung sino yung nasa number na yon, yun yung ilalagay mo sa participants mo. This process is called random selection, meaning that any member of the population has an equal opportunity to be selected. So first is the simple random sampling. Ito yung pinaka-basic na form ng probability sampling. So dito, a portion of the whole population is selected in an unbiased way. Yun nga, you may use yung wheel or yung roulette or yung fishbowl method. Through random sampling, we can find out what the population is like without studying everyone. So to obtain a simple random sample, all members of the population being studied must have an equal chance of being selected. Okay, and then we have systematic random sampling. Ito yung elegant variation daw ng random sampling. So in cases where all the members of a population are known and can be listed in an unbiased way, kasi paano ka nga ba makakapili ng participants if you do not know your entire population? So for example, you want to study yung students sa school, you have to acquire a list of the names of all the students sa registrar. And then yun nga, lalagyan mo sila ng numbers, and then you will use fishbowl method, and kung ano yung number na mapili nyo, and then kung sino yung nasa number na yun, siya yung pipiliin nyo. But sa systematic random sampling, yung ginagawa nila is the researcher select for example, every sixth person or every seventh person. Okay, so parang they select 6. So 6, 12, 18, 24, ganun. And then stratified random sampling. When the population is known to contain distinct subgroups, researchers often prefer another variation of probability known as stratified random sampling. Before lang, sa systematic random sampling, it can be for example, 6, and then 16, 26, 36, ganun. It will depend on you lang kung ano yung pipiliin mo. Yun nga. So stratified random sample, this is obtained by randomly sampling from people in each subgroup in the same proportions, meaning the population and the subgroup, and then you have to look for their subgroup as well. You identify yung subgroup. For example, you have a company that you want to study, and then 100 yung employees. So hindi ka lang pipili sa managers. It may be na 50% sa managers, 50% sa workers, or 10% workers, 90% managers. It would depend on you kung anong percentage yung kukunin mo. So then your sample would reflect the makeup of the entire staff. And then lastly, yung cluster sampling. So when the population of interest is very large, this is often too costly or impractical to randomly select subjects one by one. So in such cases, you may want to use cluster sampling. So instead of sampling individuals from the whole population or from subgroups, yung researchers sample entire clusters or naturally occurring na groups that exist within the population. As with all forms ng probability sampling, participants are randomly selected. Pero yung whole groups of people are selected rather than individuals. So suppose you wanted to survey attitudes about education system sa, let's say, Tacloban. It would be very expensive and time consuming to sample yung many na people sa Tacloban. So instead, you could randomly select clusters that already exist. Pwede sa ano lang, sa may downtown area lang, or sa may, yun, sa may sagahan, sa ano, you choose yung cluster. Okay, if you could select yung lahat talaga at once, then everyone could be surveyed. Pero yun nga, the problem with this is that marami. And it would be too costly. And then, non-probability sampling. Yung subjects dito is not chosen at random. So we have 4 common examples, yung quota, yung convenience, purposive, and snowball sampling. Okay, so quota sampling, researchers select samples through predetermined quotas that are intended to reflect the makeup of the population. For example, you want to study the students in Saints Co. Gusto mo yung quota mo is 50 males, 50 female students. O, yun lang. You have to, sa quota sampling, nagsaset ka ng quota na makukuha mo yung participants. Pero I don't think nag-aabot yung 50 yung males. Yan. Anyway, you select a quota for you to attain. And then convenience sampling, this is obtained by using any groups who happen to be available. Kung sino na lang, yung mga psychology students na lang kasi nandito sila. Yung mga pharmacy students na lang kasi sila yung una kong nakita. Ganon. And then purposive sampling, when non-random samples are selected because the individuals reflect a specific purpose of the study, ito na, purposive sampling. So imagine that the purpose of the study was to measure yung success ng training program for employees sa dalawang department. So because yung purpose is to compare yung departments na to, you have to select the employees na kasama dito sa department. And then lastly, snowball sampling. It's another form ng non-probability sampling. The researcher locates one or a few people who fit the same the sample criterion and ask these people to locate or lead them to additional individuals. So usually this is used when yung gusto mong participants are hard to find. Maybe animal rights activist. Yung hindi mo madaling mahanap or makita. So what you do is you find one and you let this individual or you let this participant lead you to another participant na same yung circumstance or same yung criteria. And that is all for the lesson for today. I hope you have listened and na-absorb nyo yung mga information na gathered today. So, very simple lang naman, non-experimental designs, archival, naturalistic observation, qualitative, survey, interviews, etc.